In this video, we're going to demonstrate techniques to make cuts in a non-through mode. We'll be cutting rabbets and dados, which are two specialty cuts made on the table saw. Let me show you a couple of these. As you look at this piece of plywood, along this edge we have a rabbet cut. A rabbet is an L-shaped notch along the edge or end of a piece of wood. A dado goes across the piece, as the cut here has. This plywood has the same cuts on it. This can also be done in solid wood. A rabbet here again, a dado here. A dado could go the long way as well. Now, in making these up, there are some specialty considerations at the table saw because they don't separate the piece into two parts. They're non-through cuts. You'll see techniques to make these safely at the table saw. The first cut I'll be making is the rabbet, and I'll take this piece over to set it up now. A non-through cut such as this rabbet presents a few unique problems. In this particular piece, if we were to make the first cut, we'd use the fence, but as we fed this forward, the splitter would be in the way. So in a non-through cut, you cannot use a splitter. Now on this overarm guard, we might be able to use a portion of the guard during the cut, but we won't be able to use the whole thing. Now, on a splitter mounted guard, we have to remove the whole guard. There are provisions in the Occupational Safety and Health Act for that, and we'll talk more about that as we set this up. And the next thing you'll see is an actual setup to make this rabbet cut. There are two cuts that will be made. First, we come up like so, and then we turn the piece and make the mating cut. We'll make the first cut coming through the face of the board, and that'll be the next thing you see. I'm set to make the first cut up through the face of the board, the first leg of that rabbeted cut. And I want to share with you a few of the techniques I've used. It's impossible to use this side of the guard because the fence will be in the way. But I've made some provisions to accommodate that I think are very useful. First, I've attached a piece of wood to an auxiliary face here so that it's very hard to make contact with the blade. Now, the piece goes under here, and there's about a 1/16 inch of clearance so that it doesn't have any friction that might cause a kickback. It has to have some clearance. The device you see here is referred to as a feather board or a comb, and the OSHA standards allow for this, and they understand that many times you can't use the guard for rabbeting and grooving and dadoing and so forth. So under 1910-213A15, they talk about combs or feather boards. Now the comb or feather board aspect of it is these little tines which deflect as you push in them. As this piece goes in, you'll start to see these deflecting. And what happens then is they start to generate some friction so that the piece cannot kick back very easily. It tends to grab the piece and hold it in place. So this gives me some control. What I plan to do then is drop this side of the guard down like so, and then use a push stick to feed this through. Now, a push stick is another device, and you've seen a couple of these before in other tapes, but this particular one is designed to give me some leverage and get the piece through. Depending on the size of the piece, you'll have to make a push stick that fits your needs. Now, the provisions for this are 1910-213S9, and they talk about push sticks and other devices, and indeed, this is a place where they're useful. Well, let me get this set up, and we'll make the first cut. I have to plug in the saw now. Now, the first cut is made and it's just short of the line, but as the saw blade comes in through the other face, it'll join up with that cut, and I can slowly raise the blade to make it fit the other one, and that's fairly typical in woodworking. Okay, to feed this through this particular time, I'm going to have to go on edge. Now, the drawback of going on edge is I'm going to have to make an adjustment here, and the other aspect of it is I have to consider this piece of wood. When it's separated, I want it to fall free. I don't want it trapped between the blade and the fence. So if the blade were here, I'd want this on the non-fence side. In other words, I would feed it through like so. if I were to turn this around and feed it through with the fence on this side, when that piece was cut off, it would be trapped between the blade and the fence, and it would kick back. So that's a very important consideration. I'll show you the right way. When you see this again, we'll be set up to make the mating cut. So I'll get that ready now. I've got this set up for the second cut now, and I want to show you a few things about it. This feather board is actually made out of a polyethylene. It's a real nice material. As I feed the piece through, you can see the tines bending, and they've got so much strength that if I try to pull that back, you can see that that actually grabs and bites in. So from a kickback standpoint, this is a very secure way of working. Now, I could actually make contact with the blade there, but the board has to go through. So that's all we can do. I have a piece under here though, so I can't make contact with the blade here. And by elevating it up, I don't trap this cutoff. In other words, the feather board is well above the cutoff, so it will just float in there by itself. I still will stand clear here in the event that it were to kick back at all. And it can actually get a little bit of thrust to it, but it won't be trapped, so it won't be much. Okay, these particular feathers are nice because they can be moved laterally to wherever you'd like to position them. A real nice technique. And again, they meet the requirements of a feather board. This is a manufactured one that's available through various vendors. So let me show you the second cut, and we'll actually separate that and make the rabbit now. Okay, we have a very nice clean cut. Both of them met up, so the blade actually met in the corner as planned. And the cutoff is actually in here. It didn't do anything but sit there by itself, and there was no kickback. Now that's the approach to making rabbited cuts that works very well on a saw like this. We use part of the overarm guard for this. Next, I'm going to bring in the splitter mounted guard and show you some other techniques. You recall that the splitter mounted guard will have to be completely removed to make a rabbit cut. So we'll show you some other techniques that can be employed there. I'll be back with that saw shortly. Things look a little different here, but it's the same rabbiting operation. We're using a saw blade to make the first cut in a rabbited piece. Now, this particular piece is a little wider, which gives me a little leeway as far as positioning. I've chosen 2 feather boards to control the piece. Initially, I attached this piece of particle board to the metal fence with 2 screws. Then I set the position of the blade, both width and height, to accommodate the material that's going to be cut away. From there, I then added these 2 feather boards. This feather board acts as a barrier over the blade, and this holds the piece into position. Since I'm not separating the piece yet, I don't have to worry about trapping anything because nothing can kick back. It's all one piece. I've got a different push stick here because I've got a little more room, and I can push this all the way clear of the stock. Now, as you see this cut being made, you'll actually see some of these feathers bend a little bit, and you'll know they're actually taking control of the piece. So I'm ready to cut now. I've come up to almost that height, and once again my mating cut will meet that. I'm not too concerned about being short of it now because just by elevating the blade a little bit for the reset, I'll be in the right spot. So what I'm going to do now is reset and show you another technique for cutting the mating cut. I'll be back shortly with that setup. This setup's just a little bit different from what you've seen earlier. I've got a couple of auxiliary pieces on here. The first one I had on earlier was a piece of particle board that's been screwed to the fence. Now, this particular one has like a U-shaped channel. This piece of hardwood here gives me a clamping surface, and the whole thing clamps to the table. Now, the first thing I did was set the position of the blade and the fence so that I'd know that I'd make the cut in the right spot. The next thing I did is I put this piece on, and I was careful to give myself about an 1/8 inch front and back to be sure that I wasn't going to trap or pinch any piece. So I know there's plenty of clearance there. Now, when I get out here, I can hold it like so. When I get up here, it's a little more awkward. I really don't want to be over the blade, and so I've got a different style of feather board, and I want you to watch this as I slide this piece through. These two saw kerfs give this a little bit of spring, and I think you'll notice that they deflect slightly when I push that piece through. So I have some tension on the piece. Are these as effective in anti-kickback? Not really, but nothing can come anywhere but through here because it's so well controlled, and as long as I stand clear of that channel, I'm in good shape. So I think I'm ready for the cut. All I've got to do is plug in the saw and get my muffs. Once again, I can use the same push stick. Notice it's just a little bit thinner than the piece of wood, so when I go through here, it's not even going to contact that feather board. There's actually about an 1/8 inch of clearance there. So this is by design. I wouldn't want this thicker than the piece because then this wouldn't do the job it's intended to do. So let's make the cut. Well, once again, the quality of the cut is excellent. There's no burn marks or anything else. I can see the blade coasting in there, and I can see that piece of scrap trapped in there. It's not coming out, but this is a very secure method. The other thing nice about this is there is no temptation to reach for that scrap because there's no way to grab it. I think that's a real important part of this setup too. Well, the next thing I want to show you is how to actually cut this same kind of rabbet using a dado head, and then we'll move into some dadoing operations. So when I come back, I'll be ready to rabbet here on this saw. I've taken the saw blade off and put a dado head on. The dado head that I'm using is what's called a stack dado. On the outside are cutters, in the middle are a series of chippers, and this will actually make a square opening in the wood. We don't want a square opening, we want an L shape along the edge. So what we're going to do is hide part of it in the fence. But let's focus here for a minute on this opening. The opening is large enough to accommodate the dado head, and one of the things I like to do is make sure that it's not going to make contact with anything metal before I actually turn it on. The opening here is abundantly large, and for what we're doing, actually bringing the piece across like so, that's not going to be a problem. But imagine if I were coming through on edge at the end of the cut, I could actually fall into the opening like so. So there are times that we have to be alert to that and actually get a throat plate with a smaller opening, an important consideration depending on the job you're doing. Now, to hide part of this in the fence, let me point out this cutaway here in this wooden fence. This wooden fence or particle board has been screwed to the metal fence as before, and now we've actually dadoed out part of it to this pencil line, which is about 3/8 up, a fairly standard rabbet cut. What's going to happen now is part of that dado will actually be hidden in there so we can make an L-shaped channel along the edge of the piece. Let me move this into place. There we go. Now I've intentionally put this piece here so that I can find my reference point again. And as soon as I lock down on that, I can remove this because that was only a stop. That enabled me to show you the setup. What's going to happen now is part of that is hidden in here. You've seen the feather boards before, but there is one thing that is new here. All of this has been attached with screws as opposed to clamps. That's an important thing too. That gives you more room and a pathway. There's not a clamp sticking out and makes it easier to guide a push stick through here. And in some cases, for permanent setups or for something that's less than 1 or 2, this is a really good call to use screws to attach all of these parts to this wooden fence. It can all be dismantled and you can use the fence over if you'd like to. Now, the piece I'm working with is wide enough that I can actually make this cut. I'll get a push stick. And I've got plenty of room to guide this through. You watch the feathers, again, they will bend a little bit as I make the cut. That's a fairly standard rabbet. I could go a little deeper and raise the dado head into this wooden fence if I'd like to and make continuous cuts. I think you get the idea here though. Any portion you're not using is buried in the fence. One important consideration here is when you move that fence, be sure that the metal fence is nowhere near the dado head. That can cause a lot of problems. Now, I've shown you the fairly typical setup here. What I'd like to do now is show you how to use this in a dadoing mode. I'm going to take this apart, reset to actually cut a dado. So that'll be the next operation here at this saw. I've installed a barrier out of wood above the dado head, which is actually right under here. There's a number of ways that you can go about this, but I like this approach. I've stacked a piece of 3/4 with another piece of 1/8 with a 3/4 on top. This gives me 1/8 inch clearance and plenty of room for my push stick. Now, if the dado had been closer to the fence, I could have used a barrier like this one, and I could have clamped it to the fence over the dado area. I might have actually put a wooden piece here so I had more room to clamp it. But this is another type of barrier that can be used. I want to call your attention also to this feather board here. This one actually locks in the miter slot. The tighter you make this, the more secure it is in position. And so this can be moved laterally or up back and forth on the or in the miter slot, and it's a real good setup. Now, I chose it here because I don't have enough room to clamp because of the barrier. And I think there's an important lesson to be learned here. Each setup is unique. The important thing is to guard it well and make it safe. Now, my piece will actually go through here like so, and I'll stand to the side and I'll make the cut. I use my push stick to guide it through like so. Now, I think I'm ready to make the cut, so let's show you that. Well, that's the dado cut. It's a very easy cut to make. What I'd like to do now is go to the other table saw with the overarm guard and show you a couple of dadoing techniques on that machine. I've got the same dado head mounted on a different table saw now, and I just wanted to call your attention to the size of the opening in the throat plate. This one is narrower and just a hair longer. This one enables me to make a little deeper cut, and it's a little more powerful saw, and that's probably the design of it. But you still have to be alert to the size of that opening relative to how much dado head you have exposed. Now, what I've done here is once again I put an auxiliary face on my miter gauge, and I've cut a dado into it. This is exactly the size of what's being cut here. So I can use this again to position my piece. Now, the neat thing about this setup is with the overarm guard, I can bring that guard down and actually house this. Since no splitter is necessary in a non-through cut, I'm all ready to make the cut. So what I'll do is demonstrate, and this time I've chosen a piece of oak veneer plywood, which is another common material that's often dadoed. Plug the saw in. Now this dado is a little deeper than the one we cut earlier. We've got a little more power, but we've actually guarded that nicely without making any additions. So this is fine. There are a number of ways that you can guard the machine. You've seen a few. And what I think I'm going to do is now show you a technique to cut with the grain on this piece. I'll reset using the fence and take the miter gauge off. So I'll be back with you in a second. I'm set up to dado the long way in this sheet of plywood, and I've done a couple things different here. First, I've got a regular wooden feather board here, and then I've used one of the commercial ones up here. It's a little easier to get this in. I'll now know that I'm going to hold that against the fence for the entire cut. It's a little longer piece, so I've got control. I want to show you something here that's kind of interesting, though. As I push this piece in, I try to pull it back, I almost have to pop it up to get it out. These feather boards are very strong and resist kickback quite well. So I'd urge you to make something like this for your shop if you're going to do dadoing or rabbiting. Now, all of the cutting is actually enclosed inside the guard, so this meets all of the standards, and we'll show you the technique now. We've got a nice, clean, uniform dado that crosses the one we cut earlier. A real nice cut, no burning. We've got a powerful saw, so we're able to manage that nicely. Well, we've covered a lot of material. We've seen a lot of techniques for cutting dados and rabbits. I would urge you to practice these on the setups in your shop. These techniques can be applied to almost any table saw. These are techniques that will keep you safe in the shop. Will they meet every OSHA inspector's idea of a good guard? I don't know. I know that they are safe, and I know they keep your hands away from the blade, and that's the most important part of working on the table saw. Whenever possible, use the guard. When it isn't possible, use these techniques to keep it as safe as possible. Work smart, seek other information, and never quit learning.